Well, Scott and Greg, this looks like it's going to be a great day. I am forecasting a severe fun warning. So if you don't want to have a good time, you need to leave the program now because we've got all kinds of wonderful guests lined up who are going to be speaking and telling great stories and hopefully helping you negotiate those senior years. We're trying to do the same. Uh, Scott, I'm thinking back to when we used to work together every night. And what you may not know is after you went home, when we had some real winter storm warnings, and I was concerned about roads icing up. And oh, the worst thing that could happen would be if we had snow or ice overnight and the morning meteorologist wouldn't be able to make it in. That was my big fear. And so there were times when I spent the night at the station. I would take a sleeping bag and a pillow and a change of clothes. And here's the part you may not know. I would sneak into the sports office, which was dark. I couldn't go to the newsroom. That's busy all night. But in sports, it was quiet after midnight, and I could lay down. I used to lie down under your desk, Scott, and get a good night's snooze there, just to make sure I was ready if they needed me in the morning. But generally, the morning meteorologist was able to make it in without any issues. Now, I'm not the only weathercaster who is going to be presenting today. A little later, I think you're going to be hearing from Troy Dungan. And Troy, of course, a friend and a longtime competitor. What he may not realize, though, is that back when I was growing up in Houston, Troy was one of the weathercasters on KTRK, Channel 13, there in Houston. And I recall vividly the night he left to move, I believe it was up to Detroit he was going to. And when he left, he set off a smoke bomb in the studio, and when the smoke cleared, he was gone. So that was his goodbye from Houston, and I remembered laughing about that. I'm sure you're going to be hearing a lot more from Troy a little bit later. Now, most people who have done the weather, who have been in the weather business at any time, have a beginnings, an origin story about how they got into the business, what made us interested in the weather in the first place. Well, there are a number of things that led to that for me. Number one, my father was a geologist, so he was an earth scientist. And I was always fascinated. We would go on trips when we would take a vacation, and we'd pass a road cut, and he'd stop and pull over, and we'd all run out and look for fossils and shells and minerals on the side of the road where it had cut into the sediment on the side. And that was always fun. So I really learned from an early age that I enjoyed studying the earth, but not necessarily just the dirt and rocks and minerals. I was also interested in what was happening upstairs. Another thing that I really loved was just maps. My father had a bunch of them, and we had a big National Geographic atlas in our house, and I could sit there and travel the world, sitting in a chair in our living room and paging over one after another and looking at all of these exotic locations all around the world, hoping maybe someday I'll get to go to some of those places myself. So I had this great love of maps, a love of science. And then when I was about 9 years old in Houston, Hurricane Carla hit. Came in down south of Freeport, actually, but we had a big impact right there in the Houston area as well. We were in a rental house at that time before we had our full-time house built. It was in the process of being built. So our first year in Houston, we were in a rental. And I watched as, you know, fences came down, trees came down, shingles blew off the roofs. We didn't have major structural damage that far inland. We were in southwest Houston, but it still made a big impact on me. And from that time forward, I was fascinated by hurricanes. And this was, recall, way before the internet age. You couldn't go to a website and see what the National Hurricane Center was saying. The only way I could get updates on storms was to listen to the radio, because every 3 hours they would give the coordinates of a storm, the latitude, the longitude, the pressure, the wind, what direction it was moving. And I would, since I like maps so much, plot those on a hurricane map in the Gulf of Mexico and watch as a storm was moving across and see if it would affect us. And so that just really led to my enjoyment of studying the weather. And eventually I set up a weather station in our backyard, and I would go out before school, after school when I got home, and then again before bedtime, and had a notebook where I would jot down the weather each day. And really, by the time I was in junior high, I was pretty convinced I wanted to be a meteorologist. Went to Texas A&M and graduated 4 years later. Had one semester of graduate school, and in between graduation and graduate school, I got to go to the Juneau Icefield Research Program up in Alaska. One of my first real adventure travels, where I spent 6 weeks up on the ice field. We would cross-country ski from one base to another, doing all kinds of research on meteorology, but also geology, glaciology, geophysics. It was just a fascinating summer, one of the best times of my life. I'll never forget that. But then I came back from that summer. I was sitting in a classroom again in graduate school. And at that point, I have to say, I was really tired of sitting in classrooms. I enjoyed school. I did well at it. But after that experience in the field, I was ready to get on with my life. I had a full fellowship for my master's program. But about halfway through that first semester, I got a phone call from a gentleman named Harold Taft. Now, I grew up in Houston. I had no idea who Harold Taft was. I learned real quick, though. But Harold called and invited me to come up to interview for a television job. Now, first off, you have to understand, I was extraordinarily shy. I hated getting up and speaking in front of people. It just made me nervous. Now, I could be in a play and play the part of someone else, but me standing up and talking just always made me quake. And so my senior year in college, one of the courses was public speaking. And I petitioned my counselor, can I take another semester of Russian instead of speech? And he said, no, if you want to graduate, you've got to take this. And so, big gulp, and I took the class and I made an A. I found out if I knew what I was talking about, if I was prepared, I could do it. It was just the uncertainty that scared me about getting up and speaking. But if I knew my subject, I could do it. So when Harold called, I said, all right, this is not the way I had my career planned. I was thinking of research, maybe going to Antarctica, studying climate. But this call came up and I said, what the heck? It'll be good experience interviewing for a job anyway. So I got in my old beat up 68 Falcon and drove up Highway 6 from College Station towards Waco on the way into the TV station in Fort Worth. And as I was coming up down near Marlin, this is when it was just a little 2-lane road with a deep bar ditch on either side. I was headed north, and coming south was a big dually pickup hauling a trailer with a big smoker on back. I had a car in front of me, a car behind me, so I couldn't really maneuver much. And I looked up, and on that trailer, on the smoker trailer, a wheel turned loose and came bounding towards me. Not just rolling, but bouncing. And I was very fortunate that it caught me when it was down, rather than coming through my windshield. But it bashed in the front left passenger side and fender, and I limped over to the side of the road, and I couldn't even find that tire. I was looking for it for evidence, but evidently when I hit it, it went shooting way off somewhere into some weeds, and I never found it. I had to get out of the car, shimmied over to the passenger side so I could get out, come over and pull the fender out where it was cutting into my tire, and thinking, this is not a real good omen for someone going on their first real job interview. I said, boy, this is not a great start. But I said, I'll just drive on into Fort Worth and see how it goes. And at that point, I walked into the station on Broadcast Hill, and there I met Harold Taft for the very first time. And Harold was, a real military bearing and very straightforward. Yes, sir. No, sir. He didn't take vacations. He went on leave. And you ask him a question, it was affirmative or negative, not yes or no. So that's the kind of guy Harold was. And I went in and, I was kind of quaking in my boots a little bit. And he said that he really had all the information he needed on me. He had a copy of my transcript from college and said, you obviously know your stuff. You did very well in school. What we need to see is you in front of the camera. So without any further ado, he marched me right into the studio. They had left, this was a Saturday morning, they had left all the maps up from his 10 o'clock show that night, the night before. And so I walk out, sit on the anchor desk, and here's this big camera in front of me, and off to the side, the paper weather maps on the wall. And the camera comes on, I introduce myself. Hello, I'm David Finfrock. Let's take a look at the Texas map. And I push the chair back, not gauging very carefully how far it was to the drop off on that raised platform. And my chair starts tilting back and falling off the edge. Now, fortunately, at this point, they had cut away to the map. So when you looked at it, you didn't see me actually falling. But you could hear this tremendous crash in the background. I managed to scramble to my feet as the chair was going over, so I at least didn't fall with it. But at that point, took another deep breath, walked over, discussed the Texas map, the U.S. map, the forecast, came back. One of the floor crew, thankfully, had put my chair back up. I sat down and said goodbye and figured, wow, this is the shortest TV career in history. I'll redouble my efforts when I get back to school this afternoon. But I was amazed when about a month later, I got another phone call from Harold Taft. And he called and offered me the job. I couldn't believe it. I thought this was a catastrophe. But he told me a year or so later, I asked him why he chose me over some of the others. And he said the fact that happened at my interview. And I didn't stop down and say, oh, can we start over? I kept going. And he said he figured if I could do that on my interview, I'd be able to handle whatever came up on live TV. So it was really a blessing in disguise. What seemed like a catastrophe was the one thing that put me above other equally qualified candidates. So you never really know where good news is going to come from. Now, I started December 22nd of 1975. That was the first day I worked at Broadcast Hill at the Channel 5 studio. And for my first week or 10 days, I would go in and draw maps and learn how to do all of that, make the forecast, but I wasn't on the air yet. And this was when Ron Godby was doing the weather in the mornings. And then Harold Taft would come in at noon and do the weather and then prepare for his evening shift. But one day, after I'd been there about 10 days or so, this was sometime in the first week of January, I'm sitting there finishing the maps and sitting back, getting ready to watch Harold give the weather forecast, and he turns to me and says, David, why don't you do it today? So I had like 2 minutes warning as we went into the commercial break before weather that I was going to be making my inaugural debut on TV. And honestly, that's the best thing he could have done for me. If he had told me, tomorrow you're going on the air for the first time, I would have had a restless night, had trouble sleeping, worried about what am I going to do? What am I going to say? Here, I didn't have time to worry. I just got out there and it was like my interview. I did the weather and went on. So yeah, it's really strange how things work out sometime. Now, there have been a lot of changes since then. I mentioned the paper maps. We do these big paper maps with chalk and marks a lot and hand-colored maps. And we would go in, rip the numbers off the teletype and come in and read those and then mark the temperatures after the newscast had already started, because we didn't want hour-old temperatures. We would draw on the new ones, and and at the end of that show, you'd rip that map down and draw an entire new one for the next hour. So that's the way things started out. But then we got into the computer age in the 80s, and things have really changed since then. I think Harold wasn't real excited about working with computers. That was not his forte. He was an excellent forecaster and a great boss, but not real computer savvy. And so he recognized that this was the way to go. Even though it's not something he was comfortable with, he knew this was the future. And so Harold came to me, and we worked together on our first numbers of programs, and got the graphics done, and things have just accelerated over the years. I think the one thing that Harold would be most surprised at this point is that now you can see radar on a phone from your pocket. That would blow his mind. Harold, of course, died back in 1991, and that was before anything about smartphones or computers of internet type activity. So things have really changed over the years. And over all those years, I've seen lots of storms. The worst ones, oh, I still think Mayfest hailstorm, 1995, May 5th, 95. That's the one that stands out in my memory above all others. That one came right over our studio, as a matter of fact. After pounding all the people at Mayfest with softball-sized hail, we got the same thing at our studio. Every car in our parking lot, including mine that was 6 weeks old, it just got pummeled by softball-sized hail. Windows were bashed out on the studio. It was really a catastrophe dollar-wise in Fort Worth. And then as that storm moved into Dallas, it slowed down and dumped 5 inches of rain in 1 hour. That's the worst flash flooding we have had in all of my years on the air, which now is up to 44 years and counting. And that flooding cost 20 lives that night in Dallas. That's the greatest number of fatalities we've had from weather here, even to this date. So that definitely stands out. Other things, the March 28, 2000 tornado in downtown Fort Worth. That one, of course, came right through the downtown area, and we had our live camera up downtown, and you could see the clouds spinning around as the tornado moved right through. And the problem is our studio at that time was about 3.5 miles east of downtown Fort Worth, and this tornado was moving through downtown heading east. So after another minute or two, I said, all right, I've got to take a break. I'm going to toss it over to Jane and Mike. And I ran out onto the front porch because I needed to see if that tornado was still there and coming for our studio. I was going to have to send everybody down to the basement. Fortunately, I could still see some swirling up in the clouds. There was still definite rotation, but no funnel at that point. So I was able to run back inside and continue the coverage. The other big tornado event that stands out was when we had twin tornado emergencies. This was the worst possible situation. You had a big tornado coming up into southern Dallas County, and simultaneously a big tornado coming up out of Johnson County into Arlington. So both Tarrant County and Dallas County were under tornado emergencies. And you just don't see tornado emergencies very often. And when you do, you certainly don't expect 2 different counties at the same time, the 2 most populous counties in North Texas. That was the most difficult day for me to cover, because I would be focused in on this tornado coming up towards the Lancaster area in southern Dallas County, and say, we've got a dangerous tornado moving in, take cover. You got to cut away now, because we have to talk about the one just as dangerous coming into Arlington. And so that, it was just mind-boggling. It was hard to leave one tornado and go to the other one. But we had to do that. And that's the day, if you recall, when we had those pictures of all the tractor trailers flying through the air when the tornado hit that depot area just off I-20 in southern Dallas County. So there's been a lot of different storms and different kinds of storms, ice and snow also. I remember one particular broadcast. This was after Harold had already passed. I was working with Scott Chesner, and we were looking at a big batch of snow out towards Abilene and San Angelo. It was coming down good, and it was moving east along I-20 towards the Dallas-Fort Worth area. National Weather Service forecast snow. All of the other TV stations went along, forecast snow. Scott and I were looking at the 850 millibar chart, what happens up around 5,000 feet off the ground, and we could see this nose of warm air wrapping around coming up into Dallas-Fort Worth. And we looked at that and said, we think that snow's all going to turn to rain before it gets here. And so I said that on my newscast at 5 o'clock. And right after the news ended, our news director came running in and she said, David, you know I trust you, but everyone else is forecasting snow. She was really concerned. And Scott and I explained to her what we had seen. And sure enough, when it got to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, nothing but a cold rain. So I felt pretty good about that. That's where it helps having a real meteorologist doing the forecast as opposed to just a weathercaster. Going back to Troy Dungan, he did not have a Bachelor of Science in meteorology, but he never claimed to. He always said he was a weather expert, and that I don't doubt at all. He studied the weather. He did not have a degree in meteorology, but I respected him. He was a great communicator and explained to people what was going on. He gave the National Weather Service forecast in a very lucid, comprehensive manner, but he was not a meteorologist, and so he couldn't do some of the things that we could. There are other people on the air, even now, who are not meteorologists, just weathercasters. I don't mind them doing it. I just don't like it when they claim to be a meteorologist. My thought on that is that, if you're in a traffic accident and a paramedic comes up, you're not going to question their credentials if they're there to save your life. You are very appreciative for what they're doing for you. But the fact that they can help you, can even save your life, doesn't make them a doctor. You have to have the degree, the medical degree, to be able to call yourself a doctor. And that's kind of the way I feel about meteorologist. If you have a Bachelor of Science degree in meteorology, then you are a meteorologist. As much as I, loved the work, which has, been my life's work for, well, in December it'll be 45 years, there's a lot more to life than just your job, your career. I've always enjoyed traveling. I told you about that trip up to Alaska as a college student, and how that really got me intrigued about going to exotic locations. And I have been doing that ever since. I've traveled to all 50 of the U.S. states, and last year I completed a quest. I've now been to all 7 continents as well. The last 2 were a around the world trip. I made it to Australia and Africa. Antarctica is usually the last one for most people. I got that back in 2005. So it is just a great joy of mine to travel. And when I travel, a lot of times it's as a tourist, but sometimes it's as a volunteer. I have worked with the Sierra Club, volunteering at various national parks, for the most part Big Bend and Guadalupe Mountains out in West Texas. And I do that just about every year, spend a week camping out, helping the Park Service with whatever they need, maybe removing old barbed wire fences, helping revegetate the desert, cleaning up dumps, working on trails. I've done all of that, and it's a great way to give back when you love the outdoors as much as I do. In addition to that, I also volunteer with Meals on Wheels. I do that twice a month at least, and sometimes more often than that if they need a fill-in. I've been taking meals to seniors like us for over 20 years now. And then the other thing that I really enjoy is getting out to my ranch. We bought that about 25 years ago, about 80 miles southwest of Fort Worth. And I get down there at every opportunity, especially nice in the fall and the spring. Bluebonnets everywhere. I just love it out there. Of course, I do occasionally run into a rattlesnake out there. And usually they'll rattle, and I say, oh, okay, steer clear of him, and I'll move a different direction. But this last week, one of the other volunteer things I do is at Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center in Cedar Hill, one of my favorite places locally. It's almost like going to the hill country, but you're still in Dallas County. A lot of people don't know about that area, but the Joe Pool Lake area, the Cedar Hill State Park, and the Cedar Ridge and Cedar Mountain Preserves and the Dogwood Canyon. It's a great nature corridor with wonderful hiking trails, and I've been volunteering out there for years. And I was out there, for the past 3 weeks or so. I had been volunteering all around the parking area out in front of the building, pulling up ragweed. Because, I mean, who wants ragweed? It's an ugly tall plant, and it takes over preventing the native grasses from growing in the prairie out there. So I'd been doing that for the better part of 3 weeks, and early this week on Monday I was out there pulling up ragweed, took a step back, and suddenly felt this sharp jab in my lower leg. And I was startled and thought, oh, wow, did I just get stung by a wasp or a scorpion or something? I jumped off to the side, made a little noise, yelped as I jumped, looked back, and no, it wasn't a scorpion. It was one of those rattlesnakes, but this one never rattled, and it was a big one. When it finally slithered away, I'd estimate 4 to 5 feet long, and afterwards I talked to the Audubon Society people, and the director there, Julie, told me that a couple of weeks ago they had seen about a 5-foot long rattlesnake, so it was probably the same one. And I was just extraordinarily fortunate. That's kind of strange to say when you've just been struck by a rattlesnake, but that rattler knew what it was doing. It was saving its venom for hunting so that it could get dinner, and didn't want to waste it on me. All it was trying to do was warn me, get me out of there. And I listened. When it struck me, I got out of there. I said, all right, this space is yours. And then I had to go to the ER and get it checked out. But I was really surprised. It didn't hurt that much, since there wasn't any venom involved. It was just a puncture. Only one of the fangs actually entered my leg. And I got to the ER. They asked me why I was there, and I said, I've just been bitten by a rattlesnake. Well, they didn't send me out to the waiting room. They took me right back into the ER, into a room, and within a couple of minutes I had an IV in, and there's a doctor examining my leg and asking me what had happened. And I told him I didn't think there was much venom involved, because it really wasn't hurting much. And he agreed. They drew a blood sample and tested me to make sure that there wasn't anything in my blood, the proteins from the venom. And they said I was all clear. They wanted to keep me for 4 or 5 hours observation just to make sure that it didn't start swelling or getting any worse. But since there evidently was no venom, it was a dry bite, I never needed any of the anti-venom medication. So I sat there for 4 or 5 hours, sent out a couple of social media posts on what had happened to me. And then that night, Channel 5 had me on the air talking about my experience. In addition, within the next 24 hours, I think it was 3 different radio stations had me on the air talking about it. So it was quite an event. Somebody asked me, got another item off your bucket list? Well, that never was on my bucket list. Let's hope I don't repeat it. So to all of you seniors out there watching, I hope you enjoy life as much as I have. This has been great. Whether you're retired, uh, semi-retired like I am, I retired officially January of 2018. Since then, I've just been working part-time, kind of as a freelancer. I'm no longer an official employee of NBC5, but I still go on the air every weekend and fill in occasionally when Rick is off as well. But whether you're retired, partially retired, still working full time, there's a lot out there to enjoy. And I just hope that the forecast for the rest of your lives is sunny. Sure, there will be occasional storms. We all have to face that, just like my rattlesnake. But, we need that rain for the flowers and the grass to grow. Just be careful when that grass does grow. Look closely. Watch out for snakes. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy. This is going to be a great program today.